Hello everyone, welcome to my YouTube channel. So today we are going to continue to discuss on the factors that could affect poor eye hair staining. So I'd already made a few points in the past. So if you've not watched my video on those points, I recommend that you should go and watch them. Okay. So but before we continue, today I want to talk to us on poor primary antibody selection or quality. Poor primary antibody selection or quality. My name is Dr. Emmanuel Obodo. I'm a biomedical scientist and I'm also a lecturer in biomedical science here in the United Kingdom. So what I want you to know, like I had already mentioned on my previous video, that when we talk about immunohistochemistry, which is IHC, is immunological aspect of the histopathology lab. So what that means is that antibody will be required, a labeled antibody will be required to be able to detect a particular antigen that is specific to. Now, because it has to do with the antibody antigen binding to be able to give us a staining, okay, what it then means is that we've been looking at factors that could affect, this very antigen antibody binding that will give us coloration. Now, remember, if it is not effectively stained, it could affect the overall, decision or diagnosis of that very patient. That's why we don't want the IHC stain to be poor. So what other factors could affect poor IHC staining and what can we do? Now, what I want to talk to us now is about poor primary antibody selection. Poor primary antibody selection or quality. Now, we need a primary antibody because it is antigen antibody binding. You are going to need a primary antibody. You're also going to need a secondary antibody. But for now, I want to focus on the primary antibody. So you need this primary antibody to be able to, bind the very antigen. Okay. Now, what then happens is that if we don't select a good primary antibody that can help to be able to detect that very antigen we are looking for, it can lead to poor IHC staining. Another thing is that maybe we may have selected a good primary antibody, but the problem might be the quality of the primary antibody that we've selected. For example, if the antibody has degraded, okay, if the antibody degrades, even though it is a good primary antibody, if that antibody has degraded, it will have impact. It's going to have a negative impact on the ability of that very IHC stain to be able to stain properly. Does that make sense? So one of the factors that can lead to poor IHC staining is poor primary antibody selection or the quality. So what can we then do to be able to correct that? So one of the things we can do, obviously, because it has to do with the selection of the antibody, we need to make sure that we are very sure we have a kind of perform a kind of quality control and also perhaps maybe optimize the antibody we are selecting to make sure that that antibody we are selecting will be specific enough to be able to detect the particular antigen that we want to detect. So one of the solutions will be to optimize or to validate, okay, or verify the particular antibody that will be specific to detect that very antigen. Now, another aspect of it, which I had already mentioned, has to do with the quality. So what then happens is that in order to avoid the degradation of the primary antibody or the antibody, it is important that we store the antibody, at the recommended temperature, okay, perhaps maybe minus 20 degree or maybe 4 degree, as the case might be, okay. So it's important that we make sure that we store that very antibody, at the recommended temperature. And also remember, when we let's say, for example, when you put the antibody on minus 20, that means the antibody is going to be frozen down, okay. So it will be frozen. So when you bring it out and you use some and you put it back, the more you keep defrosting it and putting it back to be frozen again, and it continues, it makes the antibody to degrade. It kind of deteriorates the antibody. So these are also another thing that we need to be very careful about to prevent freeze-thaw cycle as much as we can. So freeze-thaw cycle means, like, is what I've already said. You use the antibody, you put it back in the freezer, you bring it out again, you use it again. So the antibody keep getting back to the freezer, frozen, come out defrost, go back frozen and come back defrost. So once it keep happening that way, the potency of that very antibody is likely to be degraded. So it's important that that cycle of freeze-thawing the antibody will be prevented where possible. Does that make sense? So I'd already mentioned, one, to make sure that we validate or optimize or verify the primary antibody that we want to use to make sure that it's going to detect the antigen that we want it to detect. And secondly, because of, even though we have selected the good antibody, it's also important that we make sure that we store it at the appropriate temperature and where possible prevent the freeze store cycle, like I've already explained. Does that make sense? Another thing is that if you are getting inconsistent results, you might need to consider, are you making use of different batches, like different lot number of the antibody? If yes, you might need to kind of do a test, carry out a test on those lot number to make sure that maybe if there is any particular lot number that is giving that abnormal result, that you kind of correct that and make sure that you don't use that in future. Anyway, so one of the factors that can lead to poor IHC staining has to do with the poor primary antibody selection or the quality of the antibody that has been selected. How do you avoid it? You avoid it by, number one, making sure that you validate or verify or optimize the primary antibody to ensure that it has the capability to detect the antigen that you want it to detect. And secondly, you make sure that you prevent, where possible, the free store cycle of the antibodies. Like I've said, putting the antibody in the freezer, bring it out and it defrost again, you put it back in the freezer and bring it out and it defrost again. That will affect the potency of that very antibody. And finally, if you are getting inconsistent results, you might need to consider whether it is due to the different lot number that you are using. And if you think so, you might need to carry out tests to be able to find out the particular lot number that may be giving you that poor IHC staining. I hope that makes sense. So poor primary antibody selection is one of the factors that can lead to poor IHC staining. And of course, I've given you guys what that can help you to be able to correct it. I hope that makes sense. Thank you very much for listening. Please, can I ask you to like, share, subscribe, and I wish you all the best till I come back here again. Bye-bye.